Welcome back to another episode of the Microshift Project Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Nick Valinchak. That's Nicky V if you're nasty. And I'm excited to join you for another opportunity to really connect and talk about just all of the variety of things that go through my head. I think that's what this podcast is really about a lot of times. And, you know, we've discussed a lot of the stories that kind of brought me to where I'm at. Over the past 2 weeks, we've kind of gone a little bit bigger picture and tried to navigate the expanse between being an addict and starting to come into your own as a human being, which is really difficult. And before we go any further, you know, got to give props. The shirt today, Youngstown Clothing Company, Wedgwood Pizza, Fernando Ricconi, Youngstown legend. And I've actually been connected with Fernando a lot of my life. This has nothing to do with addiction or anything like that necessarily, but I'm very proud of the area I'm from. Youngstown has always been, during my lifetime, a very hardworking, underappreciated, there's a lot of negative connotations that go into Youngstown sometimes. It's been murder city, crime city. The Youngstown car bomb was a really famous thing. But what a lot of people really don't understand about our community is that there is a lot of grit. There's a lot of determination. And there's a lot of positive that happens in this area that I just think oftentimes gets the lack of attention because the news really wants to focus on the negative. I think there's a psychological warfare type of thing that plays into the human mind. I can't even watch the news because you watch it and you're like, fuck, I'm depressed. This is terrible. This world sucks. But there's just so much good. And I think that's what we need to start doing as a society, is just putting more good out there. But Fernando, hardworking dude. My grandfather used to grow garlic and take him garlic to put into his sauce. And he was always just the nicest dude. And he was very appreciative of my grandfather because, you know, it was small gestures. And it wasn't a situation where my grandfather didn't have money and he was trying to barter for free pizza or anything like that. It was just a legitimate, like, hey, you know, I want to help this guy out, and if it means he has to spend a little bit less on his supplies, then awesome. And I think my grandpa would every once in a while, like, unwillingly take a free pizza. You know, my grandma and grandpa ordered the same thing. I want to say it was a black olive pizza every Thursday. I think if we came over, they would do a green pepper pizza too, but they always ordered a pizza or two a week without fail, unless like the holidays fell on a Thursday, Thanksgiving, sometimes Christmas, things like that. And I was lucky enough that when we moved into Canfield, a couple of months after we built our home, Fernando bought the property next door and built there. So I got to know him a little bit more even then. Would shovel his driveway here and there. He would always give me like a little business card for a free pizza, which, you know, even to a kid was kind of like the coolest thing ever. And the way that Austintown was set up, where his pizza shop was at, is right literally walking up the hill of, you know, some rocks or whatever. There was a sports card shop. So I'd get my dad to take me there, turn in my free pie coupon, walk up to the sports card shop, buy a couple of collector's choice baseball or football packs, and just like go home and be a kid. And so he was always really cool. I remember going to a New Year's party over his place. I remember I didn't go, but I remember my dad going to a Halloween party. He was always really gracious and giving to the community. And he was someone that really embodied that grit that Youngstown was largely known for throughout a lot of its existence. And I kind of feel like that inadvertently relates to the topic I wanted to discuss today. And it's kind of a weird one. and it is the addict's advantage. I don't think people really get and understand what type of personality traits you develop when you're out on the street living the life you're living. I think that very often people look at drug addicts and they assume that they, just steal for a living, or, if you're female, you commit adulterous acts, for lack of better terms, to get the drugs that you want. And I don't think that's always the case. And how I would kind of explain it is that there are I think for all qualities in life, it's kind of like the yin and the yang, right? There's a good side of it and there's a bad side of it. Unquestionably, one of the biggest negative connotation traits that addicts tend to develop is the skill of con artistry, right? Because we have to be able to talk a game to be able to get over on people, to be able to get the things we want. It's not like we just have an endless supply of money and can just go out and buy the drugs we need consistently. No, we have to come up with ways to do that. And oftentimes we set ourselves up in positions where we can run schemes on people to be able to get, and a lot of times it really is just enough to get enough, probably not even for the day, but just enough for that moment. And don't get me wrong, theft and things like that are still a big part. But I think what goes unheralded and could use a little more discussing is how sometimes living as an addict who doesn't have means, right? So we're not talking about like the CEO who's making several $100,000 a year and is addicted to Coke, but is able to go take money to his Coke dealer and buy Coke to do it. No, I'm talking about the crackhead, the heroin addict, the person who's without means and has to find ways to continuously support their habits on a day-to-day basis. I think you sharpen traits like resourcefulness, creativity, especially under pressure, definitely risk-taking, and the ability to hustle relentlessly. A funny story was earlier today, as I was just flipping through my Facebook stories, I found this older lady who, was talking about like hustle. And she said something to the extent of like, you got to keep on hustling because somewhere out there, a crackhead is willing to out hustle you. And that's the reality of the situation, is that that type of mentality and being in that addiction, you oftentimes have to push harder than most other people do to be able to get the things that you want. There's a lot of walls that you have to break through to get the things that you want. And just, I would assume that if you think about this from a very logical perspective, you can understand how that behavior, how those traits could just as easily be flipped and become very powerful tools in the tool belt that people can work with and use to improve their lives. And especially for entrepreneurs, like there's a lot of times where I can attach a former feeling from my days of drug addictiveness, drug addiction, and tie it to what I'm going through in the moment. And when I want to give up, I will sometimes go back and think about like, what kind of fool are you that you're faced with something that you have all the tools in the world to be able to work your way through, and you're going to quit, but you would have gone to the earth's end to make sure you were able to get your fix that night. To be, if you needed to get an oxy, you would have done whatever you had to do, steal, rob, whatever you had to do, short of murdering and performing sexual actions on another man. Not going to do that. But I think the key thing in here is when you leave those things left unchecked, those traits that I described, risk-taking, relentless hustle, they can be destructive for sure. And I think there's an argument to be made even that when you become sober, those things can still become destructive. I can tell you that even now, sometimes I find myself wanting to take more risk than I actually need to do. And I have to pull myself back a little bit and be like, no, that's not what we need to do here. But when you redirect that, especially into the realm of entrepreneurship and leadership, these same traits that otherwise would have been looked at so negatively when measured through the lens of drug addiction can become such a strength and so powerful. So what I want to do is just take a little time in this podcast and explore how we can flip the script into making these negatives a positive. Because I think at the end of the day, if you haven't caught the gist of what this podcast is really about, this podcast really is about injecting more positivity into this world. And the way that I've been able to do that is by having those personal experiences. And I encourage everyone to go listen to the first 6 episodes of this podcast to really get a good understanding of what those things were for me. They weren't these huge events in my life, right? It wasn't graduating college. It wasn't starting a business. It wasn't my mother dying. It was really small conversations that I had with people that really turned the light bulb on in my head and really got the motor moving. And so I think what we want to do is we want to be able to understand how just because something can be a negative, it can just as easily, on the reciprocal side of things, be a positive. I think about that mentality you have of never quitting, and I'm going to use my ex-wife as an example here as much as I don't really want to, but I think about when she got back on drugs after coming out of the mission and after getting clean, and I think about how her daily actions took place, and it was a constant barrage of trying to see if she could go to the bank and convince the person in the bank that she needs to take money out of our bank account, even if she didn't have actual access to it. And it sounds crazy out loud to say that. And you're probably thinking to yourself, like, yeah, no bank is going to do that. No, I assure you that there are human beings inside that bank. And human beings sometimes will allow emotions to dictate the actions that they take. And so what ends up happening is if I can come in there and I'm crying and I give a compelling story that my husband is a deadbeat and he's keeping all my money from me and he's having an affair and all this other stuff, now you're tugging on the heartstrings of people and you're going to get them to perform the activity you want, even if it's against the policies of the very institution that puts bread on their table and a roof over their head. I think about how she handled interactions with family and how she made herself morph into a different person around them to make them feel comfortable that no, I'm not doing that stuff anymore. And all I need is this money so that I could XYZ. And if you give it to me, it will finally give me the opportunity to be able to like do whatever I need to do. I just need to go. I need, $100 to go stay at this motel tonight and get some food. And then after that, someone's picking me up in the morning and I'm going to rehab, or I've got a bed waiting for me, and all I'd need to do is have money for a medication so that I can get off of heroin and onto Suboxone or methadone or whatever it might be. And then just, interactions with other people who were also drug addicts, in the way that you're able to work with them to devise these plans of how they're going to, even if it is illicit and illegal, is going into a facility and, robbing the place blind. And I'm not talking about armed robbery. I'm talking more along the lines of the type of robbery where I'm doing it looking you in the eyes with a smile on my face, but I'm loading up my pockets at the same time. And in full transparency, that was a lot of my gimmick too. I did not look like the average drug addict. I was a cleanish cut kid from the suburbs, and obviously I'm white as well. I don't know if you noticed that, but these things really made it easier for me to get people on my side and to tell a story that they believed and they wanted to try to help the person who was telling the story out. And so at the end of the day, when you start unpacking a lot of those things, what do you see in terms of the skill set of the person I described? If I would have completely wiped out the defining factor that we were discussing, my wife as a drug addict and me as a drug addict at the time, you would see a lot of psychology being used, right? The ability to go into a place of business and to sit down and understand and analyze the person sitting across from you, understanding how to pick up on little habits that they have when they talk or when you say things, how it gets them to emote. And then when you're able to get them to emote, how you're able to start holding them by the hand and walking them through the path that you want to take. Because once they're starting to let their emotions get involved in the scenario, they're no longer the ones in power. You are. Now, whether we want to be honest with ourselves or not, those same types of things are the qualities that you could say about some of the best salespeople that are out there. Salespeople that are so good that you didn't even have the idea in your head that you wanted something or that you wanted to do something, but a few minutes of conversation with them, all of a sudden you're holding keys to something that you never in your life imagined that you wanted. And we would look at people like that and we would almost laud them and say, wow, they're the best at what they do. But I'm here to tell you that there's no difference between the person who uses a line of questioning and reasoning and analysis to understand the person they're talking to and walking them to the outcome that they want to achieve, than the drug addict who goes in and manipulates the teller or the bank manager or whoever it might be. All we've really done is describe the exact same type of activity that's taking place. And sure, the end use of what comes out of that is likely to be dramatically different, but we're really describing the same skill set in there. One being used for negative, and I'm not going to argue that it's being used for negative, but one being used for positive, but it's the same skill set, right? And so I think what we have to understand is that so often we try to put this cover over the addict and assume that everything they're doing is bad. And if you tell somebody that they're going to do what everything they're doing is bad, but that's all they do, they're just going to assume that they're a bad person, and they're going to extend their bad behavior further. And I don't really believe that a person is that far gone that they can't be brought back to the middle, right? It takes time and it takes effort, but we all have the same types of characteristics. We all have those things in us that can be used for good or for evil. And a lot of this goes to empathy. You wouldn't think twice about saying that the skill set of the salesman who's able to use charisma and persistence and charm to achieve the results they want is any different than that of a drug addict, except we have defined those two things, and we have asserted that a salesperson is less of a slimy person than a drug addict, and that a salesperson is an okay to admirable job title for somebody to hold. And obviously a drug addict is not a good title for somebody to hold. We don't want to direct people to be drug addicts, but what we don't want to do, and what the point of this is all about, is we don't want to continue to put the drug addict down to make them feel like there's nothing redeemable about the things that they're doing in life. And so at the end of the day, what I think we all need to do is, when we see those people, understand what I have said and understand that we need to have the willingness to tell these people, hey, you might be in a dark place right now, and the things you might be doing aren't good for you, and they're harmful to the community in which you belong. But if you just stop performing the negative behavior you're performing with drug addiction, all of those things that have allowed you to become a successful drug addict can allow you to become a successful business person, entrepreneur, leader, teacher, recovery counselor. There's no limit to the type of thing that you can do. And I think that's the real instruction that we, as people who are more grounded and are either recovered from those same mistakes ourselves, or have never been through them, but are just willing to have that empathy to help hold someone's hand, to help them cross that bridge back to reality. There's an astonishing lack of that right now. There's a lot of people who are willing to say it with their words, but when it comes to their actions, especially when it is done to them, when it is someone who has affected them in that type of way, you find an astonishingly low amount of people who are willing to put their money where their mouth is. And so as a culture, let's be more of that. Let's do more of being the money where our mouth is, as opposed to just willingly say things but unwillingly lend a hand when it's needed for other people. I think we're going to revisit topics like this. This is going to be one of the last podcasts I do by myself. In the coming weeks, I'm going to start to bring other people in, and I'm excited about that. And I've always been upfront with the fact that I don't want this to just be a podcast where I am always just reaching for that next level above me so that I can get further and further. Because sure, those people have a lot of people that follow them, and we can help get a broader message out. But there is a real desire on my end for people who listen to this to get the help that they need as well. And so I'm reaching out to some of the people that I've come across with over the last 20 years of my life. And some of these people are, people who have 40 followers on Instagram. And the reason I want to talk to them isn't because I'm trying to use them to get ahead. It's because they've been through some things. And when you've been through something, you have a story to tell that can help somebody else. So with that, we're at about 25 minutes. I think, like I said, when we hit the point where we're bringing in guests, we're probably going to be talking a little bit longer, and that's okay. I like to use these as opportunities to just really warm up the audience to understand what this is all about and what I'm hoping to get as an end result. If you like what you've heard today and you know someone who this would be impactful for, I would be forever in debt if you shared this with them. Again, I would be in debt if you subscribed on YouTube, on whatever podcast service you listen to this on. And if you want to connect with me on social media, I'm always around. You could find me at Nick from CWE on Twitter, on Instagram, and the Microshift on YouTube. And we will see you next time. Have a great day.